This is an N95 mask cover sewing tutorial, a variation called the Olson-Olsen. The original instructions were developed by Unity Health Cedar Rapids. This mask is reusable and washable and fits N95 filters and 0.3 micron filters with some adjustment. This version uses more conventionally available materials and also uses a nasal strip to provide some support in the nose area. To make this mask, you'll need some cotton weave fabric, some all-purpose thread, 2 hair ties, and some scissors and a sewing machine. A link to the original Olson instructions can be found in the video description. These instructions also include the pattern for how to cut out the 6 pieces of fabric we'll use in order to make this mask. There are 6 pieces of fabric in this pattern: 2 face, 2 mouth, and 2 cheek. We'll start with the 2 face pieces. Line up the 2 face pieces as shown. You're going to sew an arc on that top edge. Put the fabric into the machine. Lower the foot and lower the needle, locking the fabric in place. Go forward a little bit and then go back to lock the threads in place. You're going to want to be about 1/4 inch away from the edge. Continue sewing straight all along the arc until you get to the opposite side. If your fabric gets bunched up, raise the foot a little bit and adjust. Go all the way to the end and then back out a little bit to lock it. Pull the threads out and snip. Now you've got your face 1 and face 2 pieces sewn together. Look at that. First line down, it's looking great. Next up, we're going to get our mouth 1 and mouth 2 pieces, line them up really good, they're identical, and we're going to be stitching across the very top of that arc. Put the fabric into the machine, lower the foot, put the needle down, and just like on face 1 and face 2, you're going to sew along that arc, go forward a little bit, then back out, and then continue along that edge. Remember, if the fabric gets a little bit bunched up, raise that foot, adjust, and then just continue on until you get to the end. When you get to the end, back out a little bit, locking those threads in place, and then pull, snip, snip, snip. And now we have our second piece done. Way to go, you guys. Notice on the edges you have the ends that are locked in place. Next up, we're going to take that mouth 1 and 2 piece that we just finished, and we're going to fold over that raw edge on the very ends, starting with one side, but we'll eventually do it to both. Fold over that edge to about that 1/4 inch and then feed it into the machine. Put that foot down, insert your needle, and for this we're going to switch to a zigzag stitch, not a straight stitch. So insert the needle and then start going forward, back out a little bit to lock those threads in place, and then continue on. If you want to use some pins in order to keep this down, more than welcome, and then just keep going. What you're trying to shoot here for is to have the needle pierce the single fabric on the left and then the double fabric on the right. Once you get to the end, back out a bit to lock those threads in place again, and then pull, snip, snip. This is the finished product. Again, we used a zigzag stitch, but if you want to use a straight stitch on this, that's perfectly fine. We'll flip it over, and on the other side, we're going to do the exact same thing. Put the fabric in the machine, lower that foot, put that needle in, make sure you try to get that zigzag so that way you're piercing the single fabric on the left side and the double fabric on the right side. Double back on yourself at the beginning to lock in those threads, and then continue on till the end. When you get to the end, double back again just to lock those in. Then pull and snip. Now we're looking at that finished seam. It looks absolutely beautiful. And with those 2 seams done, we can start to see this mask, at least the front part of it, take a little bit more shape. You can kind of see where we're going with this now. For this next part, we're going to be working with cheek 1 and cheek 2, and these 2 pieces are the same. And if you line them up, they do match up perfectly, but if you rotate one of them, you'll see that they're not the same this way. To make sure that the fabric is matched up perfectly, lay your cut fabric over these templates to get the shape right. Take one of those cheek 1 or 2 fabric pieces, and we're going to fold over that raw edge on one side about 1/4 inch, very similar to what we did on one of the previous pieces of fabric. We're going to be sewing across that whole thing on a zigzag stitch. Make sure you lock your threads in place and then continue on the whole length. When you get to the end, lock your threads in place again, and then pull, snip, and this is what the finished product looks like. For the other cheek, it might be helpful to put the cut fabric pieces over the pattern to make sure you have them oriented correctly. Each piece should be folded up and sewn. Next up, we'll be sewing the mouth 1 and 2 pieces to the first cheek 1 piece. And to do this, we're going to use the face 1 and 2 piece that we completed earlier as somewhat as a guide to make sure that we get the overlap on these 2 pieces set correctly. Line up the mouth 1 and 2 piece and just put it right on top of the face 1 and 2 template that we're using, and you're going to want to make sure that the front edge is just really clean all the way around. Cheek 1 should be facing with the seam up, not down. Make sure that the seam is facing up. Then line it up with the template as well. Take your time to make sure that the edges are all lined up perfectly. We're going to pin just these 2 pieces together in these 2 spots. Again, we want to make sure that we're only pinning the top 2 pieces of fabric. Remember, there's a 3rd piece under there. Once you have it pinned, do a double check to make sure that things still line up perfectly. Now we're going to flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. Make sure you have that raw stitch facing up, and on the other cheek piece of fabric, make sure you have that stitch facing up as well. Line up the pieces once again, and just like on the other side, you're going to pin in 2 places to keep those 2 pieces of fabric together. We're going to sew along these outside edges, just those top and bottom edges. We don't want to sew along that line because we want to keep this pocket open. We're going to sew on the right and left side of this part, and then we're going to flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. We're just doing a simple 1-inch straight stitch on this, and when you put your foot down, you're going to want to make sure to have about a 1/8 inch seam allowance on the edge. And just go forward. No backing required on this. We're not going to try to lock these threads into place. And then pull and snip. Here's that finished 1-inch straight stitch on the front and the back side, just to give you a good look at it. We're going to flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. Just another simple 1-inch straight stitch. No backing required. Make sure you're about 1/8 inch away from that seam edge. When you're done, this is what it should look like. Nice big pocket there for where the filter should eventually go. Now the mask is really starting to take shape. Complete that 1-inch straight stitch on the other side, and that'll finish it up for this step. Now that we have the mouth fabric and the cheek fabric sewn together, we're going to attach both of those to the face part. To make this a little bit easier, we're going to try to flatten that fold along that middle seam edge. We're going to do this with an iron. It'll be a lot easier to sew these 2 pieces together if those 2 seams are folded flat. Thankfully, we don't have to iron flat the whole seam. We just need to do the 2 edges on both pieces of fabric. One way of doing this is to put your iron vertically and get it nice and hot up to a cotton setting. It's a little bit tricky to get the fabric folds to lie flat, so just take your time and be patient with it. And once you've got it flat, you can press it up against the side of the iron, make sure not to burn your fingers, and then just move it back and forth, back and forth. And after a little bit, it'll make those 2 pieces start to lie flat. Do this on the other side of the face fabric assembly as well. When you're done with the face fabric, move on to the mouth fabric and do the same procedure. When you're done, flip it around and do it on the last part, and this can get a little bit fiddly, so don't worry if you're struggling on it. We definitely struggled with it too. We're finally going to align the 2 pieces of fabric and put them together. This is the correct way. You can see the nose is all lined up on top, but just for clarity, we're going to show you the incorrect way. And when you do that, the noses don't line up, it's all bumpy on top. And if you were to flip it to the bottom side, you could see that the bottom side, those edges also aren't lining up very well. Again, we're going to put it back to the correct way. And for this next part, we want to sew the back 2 pieces together. But to make sure that we're going to sew the right 2 pieces of fabric, here's the trick. Take the left blue part, the very outer side like a cover of a book, and the right white part like the cover of the book. Grab those 2 and then let them fall, keeping them held together, and then press them together like that. and that's going to make sure that your whole mask assembly is all lined up. When you get the two pieces aligned properly, you're going to push that inner white nose part into the blue outer face fabric, and that's going to align the fabric all nicely on the inside of that outermost curve. It should look like this on the inside when you're done. All that's left is to make sure that the rest of the fabric is aligned, so get it down right into the corners and make sure that the two are all lined up. When you're done, it should look something like this. Our next step is going to be to line up the seam on the front part of the mask, and we're going to pin it in two locations to make sure that it doesn't move. This is why we wanted to iron those seams flat. It makes pinning and sewing these a lot easier. With one side done, flip over the mask and move on to pinning the other side. Again, it's important to make sure that the seam at the top is lined up perfectly, so take a little bit of extra time, make sure the seam is lined up, and then put the two pins in. When you're done pinning the front part of the mask, we're going to move on to the sides, and we're just going to put one pin in here just to keep these fabrics aligned, but you're going to want to align the fabric first. Make sure this bottom edges are nice and straight, and then just put one pin in right in the center. If you'd like, you can use more pins at other locations just to keep this a little bit more secure, but one pin worked for our purposes pretty well. Move on to the other side and do the exact same thing. Get the two pieces of fabric lined up perfectly, and then put in one pin or more, depending on how comfortable you are. The next step of this is going to be sewing the entire perimeter all the way around the mask, and this is finally going to lock the two pieces of fabric together and give our mask our final shape. Now you might be thinking that the mask looks a little bit unfinished when we sew that perimeter edge, and you're right, we're going to turn it inside out using those pockets to expose the nice finished edge. This is it, we're on the home stretch, we're finally ready to sew this mask together. You've done a great job so far, keep going. Put the fabric in the machine and lower that foot. We're using a straight stitch here with about 1/4 inch of seam allowance on the edge. Make sure to double back over your threads on the first little bit to lock them in place. And while you're sewing this, keep some gentle tension on this entire fabric piece. Then just start sewing. When you come to the area with the nose, the fabric may start to bunch up. Push that nose fabric down and just try to flatten out the fabric as best you can, and just keep going up towards that seam. When you get up to the seam, you're going to want to get as close as you can to those needles, then stop, pull out the needles as you go, and continue on. At the nose seam, it might be a good idea to double back over the threads just a little bit to lock them into place. This is an area that's going to get a little bit more stress, so it's important to make sure that it's really strong. Continue all the way to the end. You might notice that the blue fabric doesn't match up with the white fabric exactly. That's okay. When you get to the corner, stop just before you get off that white fabric, lift up your foot, and then rotate the entire mask around, so that way you're going to run down 90 degrees to the next seam. Continue on this until you get to the next corner, and then, just as we did before, stop right before you get to the edge, lift up that foot, rotate, and continue on the next edge. When you get to this bottom seam, you're going to do the same thing that you did on the top section near the nose. Again, because this is a higher stress area, it might be a good idea to double back over the threads a little bit, locking them in place more, just to give that section of the mask a little bit more strength. You can probably guess what's coming here. We're going to stop right near the edge, lift up that foot, rotate 90 degrees, and one more seam. That's all we have until we're done with this perimeter. In case I haven't told you enough, you're doing great. You can see here that on this mask we didn't quite make the threads line up. That's okay, little mistakes like that happen. We're just going to turn it 90 degrees and finish that up, and then double back over those threads a bit more to lock them into place. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, this doesn't look like the finished mask at the beginning of the video, and you're right, even after sewing that perimeter, we're still going to have to fold this inside out. But before we do that, a few more things. On those corners, it's going to be nice if we snip those corners off, because then when we do fold this mask inside out, it's not going to bunch up in those corners as much. So just do that on all 4 of them. Again, this is technically optional, but it makes the mask fit and look a lot better. One more thing we can do as kind of a nice to have is relieve some of the tension that's going to build up on this front seam. And the way we do that is just by clipping in some notches. You can see pulling them back and forth. That's just going to relieve some of the tension. So do that every inch or so, all the way around that front seam down to the bottom. Finally, it's time. Let's make this mask look a lot better by turning it inside out. You'll start on the 2 ends, and you'll just use your thumbs to push them inside out and get the corners all looking good. Those corners can be a bit tricky, so it's a good idea to maybe find something a bit sharp and pointy, maybe a pencil in this case, and just shove that all up in there and poke those corners out. Flip the mask around to the other side, and you're going to do the same thing, just folding it inside out and then using that pencil in order to get into those corners and make those corners look really nice. At this point, you're probably going to look at the mask and say, well, this is kind of right, but there's still something wrong with it. And you're right. We have to push the sides back through the mask to fully turn it inside out. So you're going to grab one side, push it through, and just keep pushing. And then on the other side, you're going to be able to grab that. And then when you finally pull that side through, it's just magically going to look all good. This part can be a bit confusing, but just keep going and you'll get it eventually. At this stage, all the mask needs is a little bit of poking around to make sure everything lies flat, so get your fingers in there and make sure all the seams are lining up. Poke that nose in, and then just have a double check around the whole mask to make sure all the seams are looking good. Once all the seams look good, then throw it back on the iron and just iron it flat a little bit. That's just going to make it look a lot nicer. With the mask part mostly done, now we have to put the ear loops on, and those are made with those hair ties that we set aside before. And it's pretty simple here. We're just going to fold the ends over and then sew a stitch just right along that line. One important thing to note is that not all hair ties are created equal. Some of them are a little bit weak, so take your hair ties, give them a good stretch just to make sure they're not going to break at that welded seam right there. Once you've sufficiently tested your hair ties, let's get the mask and the hair tie back on the machine, loop it through as shown, and then just fold it over. This is something that you're going to want to try to get as close as you can, but again, depending on how comfortable you are with sewing, this is just do the best you can on this. You're doing great so far. Get your needle in there to lock both pieces of fabric in, and try to get that needle, that line that we're sewing, as close to the edge as we can. Going to want to double back again to lock those threads into place at the beginning, and then once you get your fabric all lined up, slowly move along, again trying to keep really close to that left edge, and then finishing it up when you get to the end, double backing over that area just to make sure that the threads are all locked in place. When you've got one side done, it should look like this, nice and secure, and the threads are locked at both ends. Repeat this step on the other end of the mask using the other hair tie, trying to keep that needle as close to the edge as you can, but again, just do what's comfortable. At long last, we're finally done. Great job, everyone. Thank you for donating your time and effort to helping those on the front lines everywhere. The mask we're showing here has the nasal strip applied, which should be done in the hospital. To see those instructions and how to make a 0.3 micron filter that fits this mask cover, check out the next video linked in the description.